personal feel. So what I'd like to do in this video over the next 20 minutes or so is provide an overview of leadership theory over the past 100 years. So yes, in 20 minutes, I want to provide an overview for how researchers have thought about leadership so that we can do a couple of things. First, so that we can sort of understand how multi-frame theory, which is the theory that we're studying from our text, how that theory fits into the larger discussion of who the leader is and how effective leaders behave, and even what variables impact leader effectiveness. And then I also want you to begin to use these concepts in your own assignments. So when you analyze the leader that you're choosing in your groups, hopefully you'll be able to interact with some of these concepts as well. And you can also use that for other assignments to look for media sources that you might review for your media review. And even as you analyze your own leadership beliefs and your own leadership development, these concepts can come in and be useful for those assignments. So let's begin with the overview. When we look at the last 100 years of leadership theory, we'll notice four major trends of how we study leadership. The first involved who the leader was, or what are the perceptions of what makes a leader effective. We call that the trait theory or the great man. Then we moved on to how the leader acts or behaves. That's called the behavior theories of research, and that was in the 1950s and 60s. And then from there, leadership theory got extended to include the situations and how different contexts and different settings and even different cultures might impact a leader's effectiveness. And finally, the most recent era of leadership theory is looking at more of an ideological approach. Who do followers and what do organizations want in their leaders? What are the ideals that effective leaders should espouse? How should they act? So this is where we get into views like transformational leadership or charismatic leadership or servant approaches to leadership. Many of these terms you've probably heard and even read about, even in the sport literature. So each of these leadership themes extend on the previous one, and as research usually is, it's a response to the shortcomings of the previous way of looking at leadership. So taken together, it shows us that leadership is multidimensional, but if we just isolate each individual area and we try and say, let's say we take the trait approach to leadership and say all good leaders should have these characteristics or personality traits, then we run into this problem of the limitation of any single one of these models as being a perfect model. So taken in isolation, they explain part of what makes good leaders and what makes leaders effective, but it's really when we take an overview of all the major theories that we start to get a picture of the multidimensionality and the multifaceted nature of leadership. So leadership theory seems to always be asking two fundamental questions about the leader. The first is, am I just born a leader, or can I develop and be made into a leader? And while the answer may seem obvious, leadership theory always wrestles with this idea of do some people just have certain dispositions or characteristics or personalities that make them more effective? For example, Tony Dungy, he's known as a very mellow, player-friendly, calm, empathetic coach. For those who don't know, he led the Indianapolis Colts to a Super Bowl win, and even before that, he built a really strong Super Bowl contender at Tampa Bay that then John Gruden took over coaching the next year and took to the Super Bowl. But it was really Tony Dungy who is known for his personal or his player development. Players love him, they respect him, and they work hard and transcend their own self-interest for him. Well, as somebody like Tony Dungy, is he just born that way, or is he socialized and developed, and does he grow into the leader that he's become? And somebody like a Peyton Manning, is he just naturally, he's a little old now, he's been retired for several years, but I like the picture. Is he just calm under pressure and he can audible at the line of scrimmage and just, take apart a defense no matter how much pressure they throw at him? When he was young anyway, right? Now that he's old, he can't. But the idea is there are just some people who are larger than life, and they seem to be born that way, and we perceive them as effective leaders largely because of the personality or the personal qualities or the social characteristics that they lead from. Or are they made? Can anybody take some seminars and read some books and take a class like this and develop into effective leaders? We certainly hope that they can. But this question doesn't seem to go away. Even in modern research on leadership theory, we see this idea that some leaders just have certain traits or characteristics that make them more effective. That certainly seems to be a partial answer to the question of what makes an effective leader. And yet we also know that people can be developed and made into more effective leaders than they currently are. The second part, regardless of whether leaders are born or developed into this, are there certain actions or behaviors that can be applied in any leadership context? Are they universal? Or does the situation and the context really drive the level of effectiveness that a leader can have? So as we look at different models of effective leadership, these are some terms that you should keep in mind. Leadership traits are these personality dispositions, things like intelligence, charisma, assertiveness, that we say are just a part of a leader's DNA. So the word DNA would be synonymous with trait, this idea that you're born with it. Whereas leadership behaviors are behaviors that we can exhibit in a leadership context, regardless of our personality traits. And then these traits and behaviors can either be universal, as we said, common in all situations, in all cultural contexts, and all levels of competition in sport, or they're situational. Our effectiveness in having these behaviors or leading through these personality traits depends on and may work in one situation better than in another. Let's move on to the first major leadership theory. This is called the great man theory, or a trait theory or approach to leadership. And you can see, if you just look at the era in which this theory came about, you can see that this was a time of major industry. The Industrial Revolution had just made certain members of society very wealthy. Yeah? So you see the Henry Fords, or the Vanderbilts, or the John Rockefellers of the United States, and we said, these people just give off certain personality traits or characteristics, and people perceive them as effective. And in fact, because they have these characteristics, they could be effective and successful in any situation. So this approach to leadership theory looked at these men, mostly men in this context, unfortunately, and said, who are these people and how and why are they effective? And the research basically was philosophical in nature rather than collecting data and analyzing leadership. It used the philosophy of the time, which was individualism and the self-made man, and it sort of projected onto these leaders and said, these traits are what made them effective leaders in any situation. So there was general philosophical support early on, but then it became apparent that different traits were possible and could even be effective. For example, even with Henry Ford, he was known as being quite rough around the edges. He wasn't overly charismatic. So over time, it became obvious that certain traits didn't necessarily predict success, but it more predicted the perception that these men could be effective leaders. So in other words, these traits could predict people's perception that the leader was effective, but it didn't always necessarily predict success as defined by follower satisfaction or even productivity of a particular company. So leadership theory moved on from this idea that you could boil down effective leaders to a list of personality traits that they're born with. And then they moved on and said, well, maybe it's more how these leaders behave and how they interact with their followers that better explains what makes them effective. So leadership studies moved away from the perception of who the leader is onto the question of how do leaders act. And it did so largely through two major descriptive studies, which just means that people at the University of Michigan first, and then Ohio State second, interviewed followers and leaders and people within organizations in hundreds of companies and started to ask, how do effective leaders act? What types of behaviors do they exhibit? And they analyzed a bunch of data beginning in, actually this was in the mid-50s into the 60s. And they arrived at two major behaviors that effective leaders exhibited. They said that in order to be effective, leaders should be considerate and they should initiate structure. So this idea of consideration will be a big concept in leadership theory going forward. It's been called many different things, and you'll even see it in some of the frames of the multi-frame theory. But the idea is effective leaders will exhibit consideration for followers, and they will engage in participative leadership. They will bring in the ideas and feedback of those that they influence, and they'll consider the needs of others rather than just steaming ahead with their own agenda. And what all effective leaders also do is they initiate structure. They have clear goals, they have designated objectives, and they have clear rules and policies and procedures, and they organize work life in order to accomplish goals in clear ways. This idea of consideration is known by different names as well that you'll read in the sport leadership literature. Things like democratic leadership is another synonym for this behavior of consideration. Even autonomy supportive is a concept that you'll see in recent sport leadership research, as well as business leadership. Egalitarian, employee focused, these are all different ways of capturing this behavior that universal behavior theory says all leaders should have. And then structure has also been called authoritarian or task approaches to leadership. And you'll see obviously that in the multi-frame theory, this is called the structural frame and leading effectively through the structural frame. So we could see a certain common sense truth to this model of leadership that says, sure, effective leaders should consider the needs of others as they make plans and as they lead, and they should be organized and initiate structure. And yet we've seen examples when leaders who exhibit these two behaviors still aren't successful, or they are successful, but not in certain contexts. There are other factors that seem to still explain leadership effectiveness that move beyond just who the leader is, that trait theory says is so important, and even move beyond just a list of behaviors that always will work to make you effective. We recognize that, especially in the sporting world, sport life is so dynamic and fluid and things can change so quickly that we recognize that context really matters, that there are external and internal factors that can really limit or enhance a person's ability to lead. In other words, was Phil Jackson the most successful NBA coach of all time because of his brilliance and who he was as a person? Maybe. Or because of certain behaviors that he always led with, whether it was Kobe Bryant or Shaquille O'Neal or Metta World Peace, if you remember him. Or was it the context? He was given a stacked team at regular levels. Or it depended on, the Western Conference of the NBA and how competitive they were in comparison with the Lakers. My point, was it who Phil Jackson was and the behaviors that he exemplified, or did it have some contextual, did his leadership and become more effective because of other external and internal factors? And of course, the obvious answer we start to see is, it was all of those things that impacted his ability to lead at such a high level. So we move on to the final view of leadership that considers the context in which leadership occurs and how that impacts a leader's effectiveness. The next several slides, I'm going to quickly scan over at least 4 different versions of this situational approach to leadership, where the fundamental question is what contexts affect a leader's effectiveness. Scholars agree, though, regardless of the model, that a leader's style should fit the context or situation in which they lead, and effectiveness has everything to do with you as a leader aligning your approach and your style with the needs of the situation and the needs of the followers and the people around you that you are attempting to lead. The first situational approach to leadership was the Fiedler's contingency model of the 1980s. It's not so important that you memorize this. It's more important that you just understand how this theory viewed leadership effectiveness. It said that leadership effectiveness is situation specific and that leaders have these innate traits to either be more task focused or more relation or consideration focused, and that these innate traits influence how effective the leader can be in a group context, and that this effectiveness depended on 3 different variables. On a leader's ability to create relationships based on trust and respect. So the first part is the leader's ability to create a relationship between themselves and the follower, and that a leader could be more effective if they operate well in this consideration factor. The second was that leaders could be more effective if they could clearly state tasks and be organized and clearly align people together so that they were efficient in accomplishing goals. Their effectiveness would increase. But then the real X factor was something that Fiedler called position power. This was an idea that said a leader could be more influential if he actually or she actually had the power to act. And this was the perception of a leader's power to act. So in one sense, it was the power that the followers gave the person to act based on their ability to develop relationships and to clearly identify structure. But in another sense, Fiedler saw this power as coming from the leader's supervisor as well. So consider the athletic director and a head coach of baseball. If the athletic director didn't really free the baseball coach up to make their own decisions about personnel or scholarship or budget or other sorts of things, social media, then the baseball players might perceive that head coach's actual power as being low. So it wasn't necessarily because the leader couldn't build relationships or couldn't clearly define structure, but for Fiedler, the perception of positional power actually influenced a leader's effectiveness as well. The second major situational approach to leadership is called the path-goal theory. It happened about the same time as Fiedler's model, and it saw leadership effectiveness as primarily a leader's ability to help followers achieve their own goals. And the key situational variable here was a leader's ability to vary their style according to different situations that the follower and the team and the organization finds themselves in. So the better a leader is at shifting their style from directive to participative to supportive to achievement-oriented, the more successful they could be. If the leader was flexible and able to read a situation and adjust their style according to what the situation called for and what followers needed to accomplish their goals and the team's goals, the more successful the leader could be. Moving on to one of the more popular situational theories is Blanchard's situational leadership model. This takes this idea, the contextual variable of the follower, and pushes it even further and says that effective leaders assess their followers and they adjust their styles not only according to the goals of the organization and of the followers, but to the readiness and the willingness of those that they lead to be led. So readiness, another way of saying it, is a person's competence or the skill set that they bring to a team or an organization or a department. And willingness, another way of saying that, is their actual motivation. How much do they buy into the process? So you see this common sense idea about a leader adjusting to the needs of the follower. So this is the model of Blanchard's situational approach, and it basically says that the leader adjusts their style with either more or less specific direction to the follower, and they adjust their level of support or the level of relationship that they build with the follower according to the competence, remember the skill set, and the commitment or motivation of the follower. So I'll let you look at this slide on your own, but basically the model moves from right to left. And in the first stage of leadership, when the follower's competence is low, but their commitment or motivation is super high, they're gung-ho, all in, ready to join the team, then the coach, or the leader in this case, essentially gives a high level of direction and task style and a low level of support because, as you can tell, the player is all in. Put me in, coach. I'm ready. I'm buying in. I love this team. I love the culture. But they don't really know how to fit in yet. They don't really know what's expected. They need tasks. They need direction. So the good leader, as Blanchard would say, the good leader gives them a high directive style. But then later on, as the player grows in competence and commitment, they provide more support and less direction until finally the player or the person is highly competent and highly committed. They're bought in fully to the team. Maybe they're a captain. The coach will be the coach will back off on both the support and the direction. They're letting the person become autonomous. They're letting the player self-correct, make adjustments, and they check in every so often, but decision-making is left up more and more to the person and the player, and it's less often directed by the leader. So there are even some sport-specific situational models of leadership that I'll let you take a look at. This guy, Chaladurai, Pakianathan Chaladurai, big name. He's called Chela in the sport management research. He's kind of a big deal. He's one of the gurus for sport leadership. He developed a model that you can take a look at. It looks really complicated, but in essence, it says that a leader's effectiveness exists in their ability to align the actual leadership behavior that they exhibit in a situation with what's preferred by those they lead and required of the situation. So basically, the better able a leader is to match how they actually lead with what's required and preferred in a given situation, according to the situational variables at play. Let's say if it's an on-the-road game or a home game, what's the crowd noise doing? What's the motivation level of the players? What's the intensity level? The situational characteristics of the moment can be overwhelming. And what the members or the followers need in a particular situation can vary based on their personality and their playing experience of being in a given situation. So you see how complex these situational and member characteristics can actually become. But the model simply says group performance and group satisfaction, in other words, leadership effectiveness, depends on the leader aligning how they actually lead with what's required and what's preferred. So this model comes together nicely and says essentially that leaders need to be super adaptable. They need to self-reflect enough to understand their individual leadership characteristics, but then they also need to respond to the situation and the context of those that they're leading and what they need, and put it all together and plug in the right decision-making approach. So a quick example of this not going well and the leader not responding to the needs of the situation is Pete Carroll in Super Bowl 49 from, I don't know, 4 years or so ago. But many of you will remember, if you're football fans, you'll remember it badly if you are a Seahawks fan. And if you liked the Patriots, you'll remember it well. But Pete Carroll, they had a third and two, in the late fourth quarter. They were on the goal line, ready to score and win the game, essentially. And they had Marshawn Lynch at the time as their running back, who was averaging almost 3 yards per carry. And their third down on the 2-yard line. Everybody who's listening in knows what they would call, right? You would call a run play. You got Marshawn Lynch, punch it in, Super Bowl champions. Except he calls a slant route and has Russell Wilson throw a slant route in a tight end zone. And you'll remember, it lives on in infamy. It was picked off. It was a crazy interception. And everybody started scratching their heads like they can't believe what they just saw. Well, what they saw, most people agree, was Pete Carroll making the bad decision in a highly stressful situation. Certainly, we can all look back and say, we would have done it differently. My only point here is that this is a really obvious example of a leader not plugging in a decision-making strategy that fit the situation at hand. And last but not least, the final situational leadership model should look familiar to you. It's the multi-frame leadership theory from class. Again, this is situational because it says that leaders are effective when they are able and flexible in all 4 frames, when they can analyze a certain situation and they can respond by viewing options through the symbolic, structural, human resource, and political frames, and then develop decision-making strategies in each of those frames, and then pick and explore solutions in the frames that are most relevant for the situation at hand. So I see that I've pushed it a few minutes beyond 20 minutes, so I will let you view the last phase of leadership research, what we called ideological theories of leadership. The first being a really popular transformational theory of leadership that says essentially that leaders respond and develop 4 specific behaviors that encourage followers to transcend their own needs in order to meet the needs of the team and the organization. That the leader exhibits attributes that are idealized. They're selfless, they build respect, and they live lives based on integrity. Sounds an awful lot like different behaviors or traits from earlier. They also inspire others through charismatic leadership, and they exhibit consideration and structure and all the previous concepts we talked about. And they do this all to engage the follower and to stimulate them personally and intellectually so that followers and the entire team transforms their own self-interest and accomplishes things together that they would not accomplish on their own, and thus the team is transformed. That's why it's called transformational leadership. And I'll just introduce this slide to say that recent theories, as the name implies, deal with ideological approaches to leadership and say that integrity is the foundation and that legitimate leadership power and effectiveness comes from leading through principles. So different people have discussed different principles that make the leader effective. John Greenleaf is known for servant leadership, that says basically the leadership pyramid is flipped upside down and that the leader always leads with the followers' needs in mind, makes decisions based on the needs of everyone in the organization and not self-interest alone or the needs of the organization alone. So there we have a very quick, to me, maybe too long to you, overview of leadership research in the last 100 years. Hopefully you've taken away a couple things, that leadership is multidimensional. That while our perception of what makes a leader effective may be based on who they are and their traits, that only tells part of the story. And even the behaviors that leaders exhibit while all leaders should exhibit consideration of those they lead, and they should be organized and structure the environment in order for us to accomplish our goals and purpose, those two things alone aren't enough. The leader needs to be able to adjust and adapt their own personality, as well as the behaviors of, consideration and structure that we've said are so important. And they need to be able to adapt to changing situations, as well as the follower personalities and the individual needs of the people that they seek to influence as well. And they need to do that all the while clarifying a vision, seeing and clarifying a path a little bit ahead of where the organization currently is, so that people feel motivated, they feel like they are a part of something bigger than themselves, and they're able to achieve results along the way that sustain motivation and continue to motivate them to sacrifice for the good of the team, and to know that the team and the organization is responding to their needs as well. So I will leave you with that. I will say thanks so much for listening and hanging in there. I appreciate it. And the next step is for you to go on Blackboard and participate in a class discussion that I have for you tonight. Goodbye for now.